The Martinez family mansion had always felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. Even as a child, visiting my grandparents for mandatory Sunday dinners, I'd find myself pausing in certain hallways, overcome by déjà vu. The curve of the grand staircase, the way sunlight fell through the stained glass windows in the library, the peculiar echo of footsteps in the east wing. It all resonated with something deep in my memory. "Elena, stop dawdling," grandmother would snap, catching me running my fingers along the mahogany wainscoting. "A lady doesn't touch the walls." But I couldn't help it. The house called to me, like it held secrets I was meant to discover. Now, at 35, standing in that same foyer with my adopted son Michael's hand in mine, I finally understood why. "Mrs. Harrison," the housekeeper's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Your grandparents are waiting in the study." I squeezed Michael's hand reassuringly. At 6 years old, he was already too perceptive, picking up on the tension thrumming through the house. "It's okay, Mio," I whispered. "Remember what we talked about?" He nodded solemnly, his dark eyes serious beneath his unruly curls. "Best behavior. No whining. No touching anything." "That's right. This won't take long." But as we approached the study, I knew I was lying to myself. This conversation had been brewing for months, ever since I'd announced my decision to adopt Michael. My grandparents' reaction had been predictably cold. "A Mexican orphan," grandmother had said during that first phone call, her voice dripping with disdain. "Really, Elena? If you're so desperate for a child, we could have arranged a proper adoption. There are agencies that specialize in better backgrounds." I'd ended that call abruptly, but the comments kept coming. Subtle digs during family events, pointed remarks about bloodlines and heritage, casual mentions of other potential heirs who had real claims to the Martinez fortune. The study door swung open, revealing my grandparents in their usual positions. Grandfather behind his massive desk, grandmother perched on the antique settee by the window. They looked like aristocrats from another era, which I suppose they were, in their minds at least. "Elena," grandfather's voice was clipped. Punctual as always, his eyes fell on Michael, narrowing slightly. "I see you brought the boy." "Michael," I corrected firmly. "Your great-grandson's name is Michael." "Please sit." Grandmother gestured to the leather chairs facing the desk. "Maria, bring us tea, and perhaps some juice for the child." Michael climbed into one of the oversized chairs, his feet dangling above the Persian carpet. He looked so small in that imposing room, surrounded by oil paintings of stern-faced Martinez ancestors. But his spine was straight, his expression composed. Pride swelled in my chest. My son might not have their blood, but he had more dignity in his little finger than they had in their entire bodies. "We've asked you here today," grandfather began, shuffling through papers on his desk, "to discuss a matter of some delicacy. As you know, your father's passing last year significantly altered the family's succession plans. My father's death had been unexpected, a heart attack at 58. We hadn't been close, his dedication to the family business leaving little time for actual family, but his death had still left a hole in my life. More significantly, it had left a hole in the Martinez family hierarchy. As an only child, I was suddenly next in line for everything: the business, the properties, the responsibility of carrying on the family name. The Martinez legacy spans 6 generations, grandmother added, accepting a teacup from Maria. 6 generations of careful marriages, strategic alliances, and proper breeding. Surely you understand why we have concerns about your recent decisions. "If you mean my decision to adopt Michael," I said evenly, "I don't see how that affects anything. He's my son, legally and in every way that matters." "But he's not a Martinez." Grandfather's voice was sharp. "Not really. The family trust is quite specific about bloodlines and inheritance. We've had our lawyers review everything, and they agree. Adopted children have no claim to the primary estate." I felt Michael stiffen beside me. Though young, he was old enough to understand rejection when he heard it. I placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "That's fascinating," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Especially since I distinctly remember you telling me that family was about more than blood when you took me in after my mother disappeared." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Grandmother's teacup clattered against its saucer. Grandfather's face went through several interesting color changes. That was different," he sputtered. "Was it? Because I've been thinking a lot about that lately. About how quickly you stepped in to raise me when Mom vanished. About how you never seemed to look for her. never filed a missing persons report. About how familiar this house has always felt. Elena, grandmother's voice held a warning. Some things are better left in the past. But I wasn't finished. I hired a private investigator last month. Would you like to know what he found? Grandfather stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This meeting is over. Take the boy and go. His name is Michael, I said again, standing as well. And we're not going anywhere until we discuss the DNA test results I received yesterday. The color drained from grandmother's face. Grandfather gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. In the heavy silence, I could hear the antique clock ticking on the mantel, marking seconds that felt like hours. What DNA test? Grandmother finally whispered. I reached into my bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. It's interesting, isn't it? How much family secrets can cost. How much people will pay to keep them buried. But you know what's even more interesting? I placed the envelope on grandfather's desk. How much truth can reveal itself through simple genetics? Mammy? Michael's voice was small, uncertain. Can we go home now? Soon, Mio, I promised, not taking my eyes off my grandparents. First, we need to hear a story. A story about a young maid who worked in this house 29 years ago. A maid who caught the attention of the family's only son. A maid who disappeared shortly after giving birth to a baby girl. Grandmother's teacup slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the study like a gunshot. Her name was Isabella Ramirez. I continued, my voice steady despite the thunder of my heart. She was 16 when she started working here, 17 when she caught my father's eye, 18 when she disappeared. You have no proof. Grandfather's voice was hoarse. These are wild accusations. I opened the envelope, spreading its contents across his desk. Birth records from St. Mary's Hospital. Police reports that were mysteriously never filed. Bank transfers to an account in Mexico. And DNA results showing that Isabella Ramirez was my biological mother. Michael watched wide-eyed as papers scattered across the polished mahogany. He might not understand everything happening, but he knew this moment was important. What did you do to her? I asked, finally voicing the question that had haunted me for decades. Grandmother stood shakily, smoothing her silk dress with trembling hands. We did what was necessary. For the family. For you. For me? I laughed bitterly. You sent my mother away, erased her existence, and raised me as your granddaughter. All for me. Your father was engaged to Margaret Wellington. Grandfather snapped. The merger between our companies would have secured the Martinez empire for generations. We couldn't let some maid's indiscretion ruin everything. Indiscretion? The word tasted like poison. I was a baby, a human being, not some scandal to be covered up. We gave you everything, grandmother insisted. The best schools, the finest clothes, a place in society. If people had known the truth. If people had known the truth? What? That the great Martinez family wasn't as pure as they pretended. That your precious son got a teenage maid pregnant and you paid to make her disappear. Grandfather slumped in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. We paid her well. Set her up with a new life in Mexico. She agreed never to contact you. Did she agree, or did you threaten her? The silence that followed was answer enough. How much? How much did my mother's silence cost? $50,000, grandmother whispered, and a promise that you would be cared for. The number hit me like a physical blow. $50,000. That's what they thought a mother's love was worth. That's what they paid to steal my heritage, my identity, my truth. And now you have the audacity to tell me my son isn't real family? I pulled Michael close to me. That he doesn't deserve to inherit because he's adopted. Because he's Mexican. That's different, grandfather began. But I cut him off. No, it's exactly the same. You're still trying to control who belongs in this family based on your twisted ideas of blood and status. Well, guess what? By your own logic, I'm not a real Martinez either. I'm the daughter of a Mexican maid you paid to disappear. But you're still blood, grandmother protested. Still our great-granddaughter. And Michael is still my son, I shot back. My child, whom I chose to love, just as you chose to raise me. Or was that just about protecting your precious reputation? I pulled another document from my bag, this one fresh from my lawyer's office. I'm not just here about the DNA test. I've spent the last month digging through property records, trying to understand why this house always felt so familiar. Grandfather's face went ashen. Elena. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that this mansion wasn't built by Martinez money at all. It was inherited through marriage, specifically through my grandmother's side of the family, the Ramirez side. I spread out the property records, yellowed with age but clear in their implications. Isabella Ramirez wasn't just any maid. She was the granddaughter of the original house staff, whose family had served here for generations. She grew up in the servants' quarters, playing in these halls just like I did. That's why everything feels familiar. This house is in my blood, but not the way you thought. Grandmother sank back onto the settee, her composure finally cracking. How did you find all this? Property records are public, and old servants talk, especially when someone asks the right questions. Maria? I called out, knowing the housekeeper was listening from a hallway. Would you join us, please? Maria entered, her gray hair neat under her cap, her spine straight despite her years. She'd been here as long as I could remember, always watching, always silent. Until now. I knew Isabella, she said quietly, helped raise her after her parents died. Watched her grow up in these halls, and I watched them send her away when she needed us most. You knew? Grandmother's voice was barely a whisper. All these years. We all knew, Maria replied. The whole staff knew. We kept your secrets, protected your lies, but we never forgot. I took Michael's hand, drawing strength from his presence. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to sign over control of the family trust to me, not as your granddaughter, but as Isabella Ramirez's daughter, the rightful heir to both sides of this legacy. And if we refuse, grandfather's attempt at defiance was weakened by the tremor in his voice. Then everything comes out. The pregnancy, the cover-up, the payoff. I wonder how the board of directors would react to learning that their chairman engineered the disappearance of a teenage girl, or that the great Martinez family fortune is built on stolen inheritance and buried secrets. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed the hour, its deep tones reverberating through the heavy silence. Finally, grandfather reached for his pen. What will you do? Grandmother asked as he began signing the papers my lawyer had prepared. With the business, the house, everything. I looked down at Michael, who had been watching the entire scene with quiet dignity. I'm going to build something new, something honest, a legacy that doesn't depend on lies and shame. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings and financial transitions. My grandparents retired to their villa in Spain, their carefully constructed world of privilege and pretense crumbling around them. The family business underwent a transformation, with new policies emphasizing transparency and ethical practices. But the real work was personal. With Maria's help and my investigators' contacts, I finally tracked down Isabella Ramirez. She was living in a small town outside Mexico City, teaching at a local school. The woman who opened the door to my knock had my eyes, my smile, and 29 years of pain etched into her face. Elena, she whispered, reaching out to touch my cheek, as if she couldn't believe I was real. Mom, I replied, the word feeling both foreign and deeply right on my tongue. We spent hours talking, crying, sharing the stories of our separated lives. She told me about growing up in this very house, about falling in love with my father despite knowing it was forbidden, about being given an impossible choice. They said you would have a better life without me, she explained, tears rolling down her cheeks. That you would be educated, privileged, protected. I was so young, so scared. I convinced myself they were right. They weren't, I said firmly, holding her hand. No privilege is worth losing your mother. When I introduced her to Michael, she wept again, this time with joy. My grandson, she said in Spanish, gathering him into her arms. Mi nieto precioso. Michael, who had been learning Spanish since I adopted him, replied shyly, Hola, abuela. The Martinez mansion has changed now. The stern portraits of past patriarchs have been replaced with photographs showing the true history of the house, including pictures of the generations of staff who kept it running. The servants' quarters have been converted into a community center, offering education and support to immigrant families. Isabella, my mother, splits her time between Mexico and here, teaching Spanish and sharing stories about the house's history. Michael adores her, soaking up the language and culture that should have been my birthright. Last week, we hosted a family dinner in the formal dining room. But instead of the cold, hierarchical affairs I remember from childhood, this one was warm and loud and real. Maria and the other staff sat with us as equals. My mother's laughter rang through the halls. Michael ran around the table, no longer constrained by rules about proper behavior. Mommy, he asked later that night as I tucked him into bed, are we a normal family now? I thought about our unconventional household, the adopted son, the long-lost mother, the staff-turned family, all the hidden stories finally brought into the light. No, Mio, I replied, kissing his forehead. We're not normal. We're real, and that's much better. The next morning, I found my mother in the library, running her fingers along the same mahogany wainscoting that had always drawn me. I used to do this too, she said, smiling at the memory. The house remembers, even when people try to forget. Did you ever think you'd be back here? I asked, joining her by the window. Never, she admitted. But life has a way of bringing truth to light. Your son taught me that. I raised an eyebrow. How so? Because you chose him with love, just as I chose to have you. The Martinezes never understood that family isn't about blood or status or inheritance. It's about love, about choice, about seeing the truth in each other's hearts. As if summoned by our conversation, Michael appeared in the doorway, proudly carrying a book of Spanish stories Maria had given him. Abuela, he called out, will you read with me? My mother's face lit up with joy. Of course, my amor. Come, sit with us. As I watched them settle onto the window seat, sunlight streaming through the stained glass and casting rainbow patterns across their faces, I finally understood why this house had always called to me. It wasn't just the physical structure that felt familiar. It was the echoes of love, of belonging, of truth that had been buried but never forgotten. The Martinez family legacy didn't end with my revelation. It was reborn, transformed into something stronger and more beautiful than mere bloodlines could create. In the end, the greatest inheritance wasn't the money or the property or the family name. It was the courage to choose love over pretense, truth over tradition, and real family over rigid rules about who belongs and who doesn't. Every Sunday now, we still have family dinners in the big house. But instead of cold silence and careful manners, the rooms ring with laughter, with stories in English and Spanish, with the sound of children running through halls that once echoed only with whispered secrets. And in these moments, I look at my chosen son and my found mother, at the family we've built from the ashes of lies. And I know that some inheritances are worth more than all the Martinez millions combined. They say home is where the heart is. But sometimes, home is also where the truth finally breaks free, where long-buried love resurfaces, and where new stories begin. In the end, that's the only legacy worth passing on.